In this lesson, we're going to learn how to manipulate data in our local stateless components. And then when we want to make a change, we're going to notify the parent component like we looked at in the introduction video to this section of the course. So what we in fact do is use a one-way data flow down from here, so we pass the detail down. However, when we want to change something like editing a passenger's name, how do we tell this component that something has changed? So the first thing that we'll do is jump into the passenger detail component. What we'll do is set up a div around the name so that we can actually see when we've updated the passenger's name. And what we'll do above is create another div, but inside of here, what we're going to use is an input. So we're going to do input type equals text. Now again, we're going to use a binding. So we're going to bind to the value. And then we're going to bind the detail.full name. So you can see here that we're using the value and we're binding the same as this expression here. So what we're going to do is when we click a button, we're going to allow the user to be edited. Once we've finished editing, we're going to send a message up via an event to the parent component to then tell it that something has changed. So to do this, what we're going to do is use an input event on this input. So what we can do is use the event binding and we're going to do input. We're going to create a function called onNameChange and we're going to pass in a reference to this input. Now what we're going to do is just simply create a template ref, which we learned about earlier. So we're going to do name and we're going to pass this name.value into this nameChange function. So when something changes in our input, we should see that this function gets called. Now we don't actually have this function on our class at the moment, so we'll go ahead and implement it here. Now we're only going to get a value back, so it's going to be a string. So what we'll do is go ahead and log this out and we'll say value and we will pass the value as the argument to the console log. So let's go and test this out in the browser and then we'll come back and add the editing toggling functionality. So you can see that each of our passengers now has an input box next to their name, so they have the name, and we also have their name bound to the input. Now, if I changed his name to Stefan, you can see that as I start typing, this is actually updating in the console. So I can type whatever I want here, but you can see that this local name isn't actually changing. However, I've updated the name in the console. So what we're going to do is toggle this functionality, and then we're going to use an event output to basically tell the parent that something has changed. So inside of here, what we can do is create a property at the top called editing. Now it's just going to be a Boolean and it's going to have a default value of false. So this is technically our edit mode. Now in our template, we can use this editing property and essentially toggle these values based on whether we're editing or not. So what we'll do is create a button and then we'll close that off. Now inside of here, what we're going to do is the words edit. And when we click on this particular button, what we're going to do is call a toggle edit function. Now this toggle edit function, we will go and implement. So we'll do toggle edit. And inside of here, all we're going to do is do this.editing, which is this property up here, does not equal this.editing. Every time we click this, it's essentially going to change true to false or false to true. So this will essentially create a toggle for us. Now what we can do on these is use an ngIf. So we can use the asterisk ngIf equals editing. So if we are editing, then we want to display the input. Otherwise, we do not want to display the input. So we can use ng and then if, and we can just say not editing. So when we're not editing, we can see the full name. When we're editing, we can see the input. Now the interesting thing with an Angular expression is we don't need to just put the word edit. So what we can do is use an expression here. So we can say editing. If we are editing, we can use the word done. Otherwise, we can use the word edit. So Angular will update the actual button based on the state of the editing Boolean. So whether it's true, we see done. If it's false, we see edit. So let's go and check this out in the browser. And you can see that when I start toggling these, you can see that the input then disappears Obviously, every time we click this is going to be reset because the local state is not being maintained or captured. We are simply just asking for that event on a name change. Now, the interesting thing is that an ngIf will actually destroy the DOM nodes. So let me inspect element here. So we see we have this ngReflect ngIf. So the input div currently exists. However, if I click done, you can see it's completely disappeared. So this is why when we click back, it recreates the element based off of the current data. So even though I've added data, it's now available. When I click done, that element is completely destroyed and then redestroyed when we toggle it back again. So what we need to do is essentially keep the local state of this component up to date when we're actually typing something. So we'll go ahead and implement this now. So inside our onName change, all we're going to do instead of this console log, we'll do this .detail. So we're going to actually access the passenger. And because we're updating the full name, we can simply take this property and we'll do full name equals the value. So every time our input changes, we're actually going to be changing the local state of this particular component. So let's go and try this out. So again, I can click edit and we'll just rename this to 12 motto. We'll click done and you can see that the local state of this component has been updated and we can toggle it back. So local changes are being stored inside this particular component. Similarly with rows, we could rename to Sarah and that local state is then being persisted. The final feature that we're going to add is the ability to remove a passenger. So we can just simply copy this button and we'll paste it below. Now instead of toggle edit, we will call it on remove. Now inside of here, we will just change the text and create remove. Now we need to implement this on remove function. So on the component class, we will do on remove. Now inside of here, we actually need to tell the parent that something has changed. Similarly, when we change the name, we need to tell the parent that something has changed. So we can actually remove it from our array in the parent data because we can't remove it from the local component because this is a stateless component or a dumb component, which simply just does one job, which is editing a passenger's details or removing that passenger entirely. So the first thing that we will do is hook up the on remove because this will be the easiest one to do. And then we'll work out how to do the editing. So because we have a custom input, we also need something called a custom output. Now, if we go to the dashboard component, this is where we would expect a change. Much like in our template, when this input changes, it's an event. So this is technically an event that's being fired from the input. So it's telling Angular that an input event has fired. This is essentially what we need to do with our custom component. So we need to tell our component that an event has fired. We're going to call this event remove. So when our local component fires an event called remove, we're going to have a remove callback. So we'll just call this one handle remove. Now the event is actually given to us via this function argument as well. So inside of here, what we can do is scroll down and we'll actually implement this function. So we'll do handle remove and we will simply console.log and we'll just console log the event. Now we'll just pass the event back through the function. So this won't work at the moment because we need to set up, just like our custom input, we need to set up a custom output called remove. Now this is where something called EventEmitter and output come into play. So let's assume that we want to create an output, much like we created an input, which is our data. We have an output as well. So what we're going to do is also import something called the EventEmitter. So for passing data into a component, you need input. For getting data out of a component, you probably need these two. You need an output and event emitter. So we'll work out now how to actually implement these. What we'll do is quickly break these onto new lines so we can see that this is much clearer. Now underneath our input, because we're going to have a property called remove, which you can see here is a custom event that we're going to emit from our passenger detail component. So we have remove, and we're simply going to mark this as an output. So we can just simply say this is going to be an output which then treats this as a custom output event from our component. Now, to use TypeScript with this, we say it's going to be of type EventEmitter. Now, this has a red underline, so it needs to actually tell TypeScript what type of event you're emitting. We're going to say we're going to emit any kind of event. What we'll do here is create a new instance of this event emitter. So this essentially binds a custom event emitter to our property. So we're creating a property here. This allows us to essentially fire a custom event. So all we need to do now is go into this onRemove, and we'll just do this dot remove. So we're actually referencing this output variable, and this part is very simple. All we need to do to emit the event is just call emit. Now the actual object that we want to emit is this dot detail. So anytime in our local template, when we click on onRemove, our onRemove handler gets called, and because we've told our output to be a event, we are simply using emit, and we're going to emit this dot detail. So this dot detail is the entire input that we've locally changed. So just to recap what's happening here, we have our passenger component, we're looping over them, we're passing each passenger into the detail. When we locally edit a passenger, we press the remove button. We then fire an event from the child, and the parent gets notified in this particular function here. Just like our handle remove function inside the passenger dashboard, we're also going to have an edit event. So if a passenger's name gets edited, we want to tell the parent. So we're going to have handle edit, and that's also going to have an event. So you can think of your component as more of an API. We can pass information into it. We can mutate that data. Once we're ready, we can then send it back up to the parent. And at this point, we could then merge the changes from that local component's change, such as removing it or editing a person's name, such as Stephen, if we rename this to Todd Motto. Now let's go ahead and set up a function handler below for handling this edit. So we'll add it above here. It's also going to take the event, and inside we will just simply do console log event. In the next video, we'll actually handle the removal of these and the editing of these. However, for this video, we're just simply focusing on learning about output and the event emitters. So if this syntax looks slightly confusing, this is just the type of event. So you can think of it as this. So all the new event emitter is doing is creating a new instance of Angular's event emitter. All we're doing here is saying this is the type of the event that we're actually emitting. Now, because we've just created in our dashboard component, we've just created an edit, we need to actually copy this and head over to here. So what we'll do is create that property, and you've probably guessed it by now. We're going to create an event emitter, and we'll do new event emitter. This also needs to be marked as an output. We've already imported this because we are using it below with the remove. So when we're actually finished editing our passenger's name, if we want to go and toggle something, this might be a good place to then tell the parent. So what we'll do inside of our edit function is if this.editing. So if we are editing, we will then have the input exposed to us, at which point we can then fire this event. So much like before, this time we can do this.edit.emit, and we can just pass this.detail into that emit. So when we toggle the edit, if we're in edit mode, we want to essentially commit those changes to the parent and tell it that it's been edited. So now we have the console log actually set up in the parent, which we can see below. We have one for remove and we have one for edit. We can try both of these out in the browser. So in the browser, we can obviously press remove, and it's told the passenger dashboard component, which is our container component, to actually remove this item. However, we haven't implemented the logic to actually remove it yet. But we can also click edit, and we're going to rename Stephen to Todd. We're going to click done, at which this point, we've then told the parent that the full name has then changed. So you can see this new object here has my name in, the date stamp and everything are exactly the same. This console log is coming from line 59 and this one's 62. So these are actually both different events that have been fired from the child component. And we could do the exact same thing if we did this one, James, Louise, and Tina. So you can see here that we're actually emitting the individual objects. So in this video, you've learned how to create your own custom event object. If we look inside passenger detail, we can do a quick recap. So we had an output, an event emitter. We created a custom property called edit and remove. We created a new instance of event emitter on both of them. Once we're done editing, we're going to fire an event to the parent to say we're done editing. If we want to remove that item, we can then tell the parent that we want to remove it. So in the next video, we're going to look at how to actually remove it from the parent.